Morning, everyone. We're going to start our training today. Today, we're going to discuss how to use zip form to prepare a AIR form contract for vacant land purchase. Now, recently, I did a transaction for a client in San Jose, and it's for a vacant land about $200,000 in purchase price. It's not very expensive, but it is a vacant land that my client hoped to build his dream home on it. So I contacted the listing agent and talked to the listing agent about possibly making an offer on the transaction. The listing agent told me that there have been previous two offers. The seller did not like those two offers for two reasons. One of them, the price was great, the terms were not great. The other one, the terms were great, the price was not great, okay? Now what that means is that the price was really good, perhaps they wanted a very long due diligence period. Could be like 6 months or longer. And then the other one, the other offer, the terms were great, meaning that it was a reasonable due diligence period, but the price was too low for the and this contract, which eventually we won, okay? Only to have that transaction canceled because there was an active landslide on the property, all right? Okay, today we're gonna go through the entire process. I will take you through the preparation of the zip form. I already have an idea what the list of price was. And based on what the listing agent told me, my client and I, we came up with a price that we thought was going to win the contract, which we won, okay? So now let's go ahead and go into the zip form. This is the transaction that I worked on. For those of you that are familiar with the zip form, okay, now this is obviously my zip form portal. If I go into transaction, I came back to here, but since I only want to look at certain transactions. Now, what I did was I think I applied some kind of template for this transaction. For those of you that know how to create template, you try to use template for every single transaction to save yourself a lot of work. First thing, we enter the parties. Okay, now you will enter in this case, the buyer's information and then the buyer's email. Notice that I don't have the second buyer's email, but that's because I forgot to set it up. You should always have everyone's email in here. And of course, I have the listing broker's email and my information, and that's that. Okay, let's go back and look at what else I need in terms of the next step that we did. Let's see here. Okay, this takes me to this screen. First thing I did was to prepare the offer. To prepare the offer, I used the standard offer, agreement, and escrow instructions. This particular form, I get it from the right-hand side. Many of you do not have subscription to AIR forms, but I do. Now, your basic membership only pays for your regular zip forms, but if you also want the AIR forms included, I believe the annual subscription is like $99. For those of you who does transactions involving vacant land as well as other commercial, that's Robert right there. I think that's Robert. Okay. You should go ahead and get your subscription. Okay, it's not very expensive. How do I get rid of it? Okay, it's done. Yeah. Okay. But in any case, you know, I have the subscription, so I could get the forms that I want. You see the select library here? My subscription gives me the regular car forms, and then this air form. This requires a $99 subscription. They might have raised the price already.
99 a month or
a year? A year. Okay, it's not a month. So it's very inexpensive. I think it's worth it to get it. Okay. And then within zip form, you have the car sample form. Sometimes they're very useful. And then you got the DIE forms and a bunch of other different type of forms. Okay. I don't know what this is. I don't use it. Okay. But in any case, I use the form. I basically open up this one here, and then it gives me all the air forms that's available that I could use. So I pick the offer. I open up the offer. Now, before I do the offer, I probably have filled out the property section. There's something in here, as you can see later on, that there is a property section that you have to fill out. Once you fill out the property details, the form will be automatically populated by those details. Okay, so I go in and complete the form. There are a few things about the AIR form that is different from the zip form I want to tell you about. Many residential agents, they are not very familiar with the AIR form, so they tend to resist the AIR form. But for vacant land and many other commercial properties, the AIR form is actually better than the car forms, as you can see later on as to why they are better. Okay, but just generally speaking, they are better. Now, we put in the buyer's name here, and then as far as the closing date, now here's another aspect that's different between the car form and zip form. With the air form, sorry. With the air form, the default for closing date is 30 days, okay? But that's 30 days after waiver or expiration of the buyer's contingency. Right away, you see that this is very different from the car form. What that means is that there is no definite closing date. Because let's say, for example, if your contingency period is 17 days. Now, let's say the contingency, normally for vacant land, contingency periods are much longer than 17 days. Let's say, for example, in this case, my buyer decided that they needed 45 days to do their due diligence. So we had a 45-day contingency on the soils investigation, which means that the contingency expires after 45 days. So the buyer has a choice to wait until the full 45 days and then waive the contingency and then close escrow. Had I not picked 5 here, it would have closed escrow. It would probably close escrow 75 days after acceptance because the contingency period is 45 days. And then it closes 30 days after the contingency is waived or expired. See that one there? So really, this is how it's set up in the AIR form, much different from the CAR form, whereby we generally have a closing date that is tied to the acceptance date. Here, we have the closing date that is tied to the contingency date, so that's the big difference there, okay? All right. Now, another benefit to the AR form is that what if the buyer completes their investigation sooner? Let's say they complete their investigation in 30 days. They have the option of closing sooner. In other words, let's say they complete their investigation in 30 days. All they have to do is to notify escrow that they waive contingencies, and then escrow shall close 5 days later, okay? You don't need a special escrow instruction for that because it's built into the contract, whereby all the buyer has to do is to notify the escrow that the buyer has waived contingencies, okay? All right. That's the escrow closing period. Now let's go into the property description. Now usually we describe the property. In this case, we have a vacant land, approximately 1 acre in San Jose, Santa Clara County, California. And then we put in the street address, and then we put in the APN number. And then you put the title company information here. It says here, if the legal description of the property is not complete or is inaccurate, this agreement shall not be valid, and the legal description shall be completed or corrected to meet the requirements of. Now, usually that's the title company's name here. In this case, we decided to let the seller pick the title company. So we put down title company of seller's choice, okay. Of course, it says here parenthesis title company. So whichever title company the seller picks, that will be the title company that will be used. In this case, the seller picked Orange Coast Title Company. I think they're located in Orange County in Southern California. Because it is vacant land, we don't add any permanent improvements in here, so this is left blank, okay, because it is a vacant land. Now, to be able to buy a 1 acre vacant land in San Jose for $211,000, that's quite a bargain.
Good deal.
Not if there's an active landslide on it.
San Jose.
Okay, but anyway, it is a bargain, isn't it?
Yeah.
1 acre, but you have to figure out though, much of that is sloped though, it's much flat. So usable space is very small. So it looks like really big piece of land, but usable land is really little. Yeah, that's right. But you got really a nice view over there. Okay. All right.
The residential area.
It is it's zoned for residential. Okay, it's not commercial, it's residential. All right. Now, as far as the purchase price, the form is a little, now it says here the purchase price to be paid the buyer to the seller for the property shall be, in this case, we put down $211,000 because that's what we offer. Now, bear in mind that in this particular purchase, we did not use any letter of intent. Because it was such a simple purchase, there was no need to go back and forth with the letter of intent. We just basically prepare an offer like you do in a residential purchase. Okay. And then the form is designed differently as well. In this case, it's all cash. That's why this number is $211,000. If it's not all cash, if it requires a loan, usually you will put down the down payment here, okay? But because we pay all cash, so it says $211,000. All right. Now another thing about the AIR form that is different from the ZIP form. In ZIP form, you do not have this functionality. You don't have any strikeout. in car form, car form, no strikeout functionality. Whereas in air form, there is this functionality here. So whatever that is not applicable, you strike it out. Okay, also because we didn't have any loan, so we struck that thing, okay? Now anything that is not applicable, you actually have a lot of work to do on the air form that you don't on the car form. Car form, if something is not applicable, you just leave it alone. You don't use this strike function. But air form, you have to manually go in and strike them out, okay, if they're not applicable, all right? Now, I have a lot of work to do. You can see that. And then you got to be real careful about how you strike things out. In fact, I did it in such a big hurry that there was something that was not supposed to be stricken. I actually struck it out. And then the listing agent said, no, you got to go back and change that because you're not supposed to strike the provision out. And then I said, you're right, sorry. I did it like 10 o'clock in the evening, so I'm a bit tired. Okay, so this is after, I carefully decided, if they are not applicable, you're supposed to strike them out. So this actually requires more skills to use. You need to figure out what is applicable and what is not applicable. Now, this requires some training. I am giving you some of that training right now. Now, you see all of these provisions in here. You can kind of tell that this is actually the deposit. They have such a long provision on the deposit that I thought it wasn't applicable, so I put the deposit part. Actually, I strike out the entire provision on deposit. I basically drafted my own language in the addendum for the deposit regarding how to treat the deposit. I just strike out. This is too confusing and too much work to try to figure out what to do with the deposit, right? So I strike out the whole thing, okay? So it's all stricken out. All this thing about deposit. Because financing is not a contingency here, so it says your strike is not applicable, so I strike out the whole thing, right? Okay, I basically strike out the whole thing, financing. Now this one, because it's an air form, they even have a provision on seller financing. If you have a seller carryback, this is the part where you will use, okay? All right? All right, let's go ahead and continue. This whole thing is on seller financing, so I strike out the whole thing. There is no seller financing. And then here is where you identify the real estate brokers. Okay, you got the listing seller's broker here, and then you got the buyer's broker here. Notice how we call the seller's broker. On the air form, we don't call them listing agent, we call them seller's broker. And then the buyer's broker is just the buyer's broker. Okay, so they mean, you know what they mean, right? And then of course, if you have
called it selling broker.
Yeah, in the car form. Car form, we call it selling agent.
This is air form, right?
This is air form.
Yeah. Air form, you said you have strikeout function or no?
It has strikeout functions for air form.
Oh, okay.
But not in a car form. Car form, they don't have a strikeout function. Okay. So for some reason, I think the big difference between car and air is that car's attorneys, they would prefer you not make too many changes on the forms. So this, but most of the commercial agents, they don't use car forms. Do you know that there are many commercial agents that are not realtors? If they are not realtors, most likely they have no access to zip forms. So they wind up using air form. So you have to know how to use air form because sometimes you deal with commercial brokers that they don't work on zip form. They ask you to use air form, all right? And then if it's dual agency, you just do the dual agency thing, yeah? If one, right? Escrow and closing, usually I leave it alone. I don't change things, okay? So there is a certain way we do things on the commercial side. So we just follow the custom and practice. We do not make any changes. So for escrow and closing, I leave it alone. I do not make any change. Plus, you can't make any change anyway. There's no space to make the change, okay? If you want to make change, the only way to do it will be to strike out the entire paragraph 8 and then write in your own provision in the addendum. That is just too much work from an average agent who is not well trained as a drafter. You're asking them to draft something that they're not comfortable with. So basically, we just leave it alone on the escrow and closing. Now, there is one thing that I want to point out to you, which is on condition for closing. You see this 8.4, it says subject to satisfaction of the contingencies herein described. Escrow holders shall close the escrow by recording a general warranty deed. And then it says a grant deed in California. As you can see, other states also use the air form. That's why this is worded this way. All right? In California, we do not use general warranty deed. We use a grant deed. That's why they say in parentheses, a grant deed in California. And any other documents required to be recorded, and by disbursing the funds and documents in accordance with this agreement. You see this one that says subject to satisfaction of the contingencies herein described. I do not believe you see similar language in the CAR form, but here on the air form, this is the thing that the escrow officer will pay attention to. If they do not hear from the buyer after 45 days, then they are going to close escrow in 50 days for this transaction. They don't even have to check with either agent because in the air form, contingencies are exercised passively, not actively. On the CAR form, they are exercised actively. In other words, if they don't hear anything, it means that we are going to close in 50 days. Because if the buyer doesn't say anything, buyer waive contingencies by silence. By silence. Correct. So if you are first time working on an air form, be careful. It's a threat for you. You better calendar your date very closely. Not like in CAR form, if you forget, the listing agent will remind you. On an air form, you don't get a second chance. You forget, you forget. Your buyer is buying the property for sure. It does not require an active removal. Removal is done passively on an air form. So you got to be very careful about the date. Okay? All right.
Closing the transaction is complete.
So basically, if the buyer doesn't say anything after 45 days, then the buyer waives contingencies. So the buyer wants to cancel based on exercise of contingency, buyer must do so no later than 45 days. In this particular case, we pick 45 days. It could be any other date that the buyer picked, but we pick 45 days. Okay? All right. So this is the standard. I do not make any change. Usually you do not make any change on paragraph 8. All right? Okay.
That's restriction on this.
That's right. Okay, so you got to be very familiar with this transaction. Now, it talks about here. Oh, actually, it does say here, though, escrow holder shall verify that all of buyer's contingencies have been satisfied all way prior to closing. So I guess the escrow will contact you. They will verify. But if the escrow doesn't, you see, escrow is not required to call you on day 45 and tell you and tell to remind you. They may not remind you, but if on day 46 they see that you don't do anything, they're going to contact you and say, all right, are you guys buying it for sure now? You waive your contingency. And then at that time you say, no, we want to cancel. They're going to tell you, well, you better speak to the seller about that because now you waive your contingency. So satisfy or waive, right? All right. Okay, next one. Amendment 8.7, it says, if this transaction is terminated for non-satisfaction and non-waiver of buyer's contingencies, then neither of the parties shall thereafter have any liability to the other under this agreement, except to the extent of a breach of any affirmative covenant or warranty in this agreement. What this means is, on or before day 45, the buyer must notify the escrow that the buyer is not satisfied with the contingency, therefore buyer is canceling. That has to be sent to the escrow to make sure that the deposit is not forfeited. If that step is not taken, that deposit is forfeited.
Is it done verbally by the buyer?
You don't do it verbally. The agreement says in writing, as we will see later on. We're not there at that paragraph yet.
Oh.
Agreement requires that it be done in writing. Now, it talks about breach of any affirmative covenant or warranty. Now, in vacant land, sometimes there are other agreements. For example, now, vacant land, if you send out a geologist to go out and dig trenches, right, if there is an agreement by the buyer to backfill the trenches, and if it's not done, even if the buyer cancels based on non-satisfaction of contingency, the seller can still sue the buyer if the buyer doesn't go back and backfill the trench. Because it says except to the extent of a breach of an affirmative covenant. So that is a covenant to backfill the trench, right? All right. Next. Now we're getting into the contingencies, right? You have all kinds of contingency in here. In this case, we're not too concerned about we just use the default 10 days for the disclosure. But for physical inspection, we pick the 45 days. It says 10 or 45. If it's 10, if it's a smaller versus a bigger, you always pick the bigger as the controlling contingency period. So in this case, the contingency period is 45 for physical, right? And then for environmental, I just use the 30 days. It doesn't really matter. The 30 days really doesn't matter. What matters is the 45 because it's a longer contingency, correct? So I only care about the 45 in this case. I don't really care so much about this, and I don't care so much about that. But this is a big deal for me, soil inspection. This is the one that we discussed for a long time to decide if we needed 45 days. It turns out we needed the full 45 days, pretty much, okay? You'll know later on why we needed that much time. The rest, I just use the default because I don't care, all right? Default, we just use default. We don't care about existing leases because there are no leases. Don't care about association. I don't care about other agreements. But this is all default anyway. Okay? Financing, I forgot to strike out this one, as you can see. I should have stricken out this one. Right? Financing is not applicable. This should have been stricken out. Existing notes, we are not doing any seller carryback. We're not concerned about the seller's existing notes, so we strike out this particular one. Now, Yeah, you really have to know what you're doing, or else you don't know which to strike out and which not to, right?
Existing note is seller financing?
No, it's not. It's not. That's why I corrected myself. It's not seller financing.
Oh.
Existing note talks about, for example, there is an existing lender, and then the parties have to decide what to do with the existing note, okay? Because this property has no existing loan, so we basically determine that this is not equitable, so we strike out the whole thing. And because there is no personal property, so I strike out the whole thing, yeah. Okay. Destruction, damage, or loss, it could be applicable, so that's why I left it here. Material change, that could be applicable, so I left out here. So these two are usually, you don't strike out these two in almost every situation. You pretty much leave them there, okay? So you don't worry about them. Seller performance, that's the default. You just keep the default. You don't do anything. Brokerage fee, I left it here, but I probably have something included in the addendum about my brokerage fees. You will see it later on. I have a provision on that. And I say here, all of the contingencies are for the benefit of and may be waived by the buyer. In other words, seller cannot use any of these contingencies. Only buyer can. That's why we call it the buyer's contingencies, okay? Now, the most important one is really the 9.3. 9.3, you see this disapproved item? 9.3 requires that you inform the escrow before the applicable contingency period to tell the escrow which item you are disapproving, all right? And then based on that, the seller knows which contingency you just exercised to cancel the escrow. So it says that when many buyer's contingencies is disapproved, so you simply just write an email. You can do it by email. You don't have to do a formal letter. You can send an email to the escrow telling the escrow that you disapprove the soil inspection contingency, therefore you're canceling. It's something as simple as that. Okay? That was something that I did. I think I did it like 38 days before, well, I did 38 days after I accepted, so I still have about 7 days cushion. Now, here's an interesting part though. There is apparently a right to cure on AIR. If there's something you disapprove as a buyer, the seller has an election to cure. In this case, we did not give the seller the election to cure because how do you cure an active landslide? It's very difficult. So I think it was a redundant thing for me to ask the seller to cure, okay? Now, if it's something trivial that you're not satisfied with, basically under AIR, there is seller's election to cure the disapproved item. And it is only if the seller elects not to cure, then only you can cancel. So don't forget about the seller's election to cure, all right, if you're working on an AIR form. All right, document required before closing. This is just standard provision. Usually I just leave them alone, okay? I don't do anything. I just leave them alone. Proration adjustment standard, leave them alone. That's for the escrow. That's very similar to car form. Representations and warranties of sellers and disclaimers, I also leave that alone. Usually I don't do anything, okay? Possession, no change, buyer's entry, no change, default. You know, all of these are standard, so I don't do any, I don't make any changes here. I just leave them alone. You see the duration of offer? They don't have a default like in the car form. Car form, the default is 72 hours. Here, there is no default, so you put in your own. And this one, it says if it's not accepted by seller on or before 5 p.m., and then it's got a deadline. So basically, you have to set your own expiration time. Don't forget, for those of you that are familiar with car form, we're so used to using the 72 hours default expiration date. For the air form, there is no default setting. You set your own. Okay. Liquidated damages, usually that's just the amount of deposit. We put in 3%. Arbitration clause similar to car. They don't have mediation requirements. They're different from car. These are all standard. I don't do any strikeouts. And the nice thing about it, they have a standard provision for 1031 exchange. You see, isn't that nice? You don't have to put in your own 1031 exchange provision anymore. This is all built in already, right? Okay. And then they have the agency disclosure all built in too. See that? It's all in the form already. So even if you forget, no big deal. It's all here already, right? Okay. Okay, these are standard provisions. I don't make any change. Now, these are some things that I add, additional provisions. Here, you say how many paragraphs you are adding. I've added paragraphs 1 to 3, okay? I say, buyer shall wire 6,000. Now, of course, that was before I added. I put down 6,000 up there. Here, I put 6,330, okay? As earnest money deposit within 3 business days after the escrow is open. Escrow to provide wiring instructions to buyers. Said deposit shall be credited to the purchase price and also be the subject of the liquidated damages clause. This is something that I added. You can copy my template in case you are in the same situation, you want to use it, that's fine, okay? Now, next provision, it says, sellers acknowledge that they have a listing agreement. This is what I do to take care of the commission, because you know why? The agent did not put it on LoopNet or CoStar. It was put on the MLS. So this agent is most likely normally a residential agent, not a commercial real estate agent. So this agent is more comfortable with the MLS and with the CAF form. So when I first proposed to the agent to use air form, agent kind of resisted to it, but then I persuaded her to use the air form, and after using it, she said, it is so much better than CAF form for vacant land. She agreed with me, okay? As you can see, it's got many provisions that are more useful and helpful for vacant land that you don't find in CAF form. So basically here we say the listing broker and the selling broker. Actually, you know what? I made an error that I shouldn't have made. It should say seller's broker and buyer's broker. You should just stick with the same terminology, right? So it should say both seller's broker and buyer's broker shall split the total commission sellers agree to pay the seller's broker according to said listing agreement and the MLS rules, because the first part is based on the listing agreement. The second part is based on what the listing agent put down as the agent's commission split on the MLS. So I address this part and I address this part, right? All right. Third provision. It says here, now this is important for vacant land if you're going to be doing waffles, important for both the buyers and for the sellers. I think more for the sellers than they are for the buyers. If you represent the listing side, you got to insist that this be included in the contract. It says your buyers at their own cost shall have the right to drill one borehole of standard size up to a maximum of 30 feet in depth at a location of buyer's choice on the subject matter, on the subject property, subject to the seller's reasonable approval. And then it says buyers shall backfill borehole per standard industry practices. As you can see, this is drafted by a lawyer, more likely, right?
Soil analysis?
That is to make sure the parties know what is being allowed by the contract, because this is enforceable. This is an important term in the contract. Vacant land, normally the buyer wants to drill holes in the ground. If the buyer wants to drill holes in the ground, you agree ahead of time how many holes you're going to allow the buyer. How do we find out how many holes we need? We speak to the geologist. So my buyer asked the geologist, how many more holes I need and how deep do we need to go? First, my buyer said, the geologist said, one hole. See, you can't just say one hole. You have to say how big the hole is, right? We use standard size. If you say standard size, everybody's in agreement, standard size. Now, if you're asking what's the standard size, usually it's about anywhere from 6 inches to 8 inches is standard size. But it's better. Now, sometimes, you took my last course before on contract drafting. I said sometimes it's better to leave it reasonably vague. What is reasonably vague? It means that there's a way to measure the standard. We call it the standard size hole, right? So usually I protect myself, I put standard size hole. It gives you more room for flexibility to put down standard size. Problem is that if you put down 6 inches, if it turns out that you needed to drill 12 inches, you have no flexibility. So I put standard size, it gives me a wider range, right? You put standard size, and then usually you have to say how many feet you want to go down to, because the seller needs to know, are you going down to 8 feet or are you going down to 30 feet? You need to know that, right? And usually the buyers want to choose where to drill, but the seller has the right to approve about where the buyer can drill, right? So you put in language like that. And if you're the seller, you want to make sure that this sentence is included because you want to backfill the borehole after all of this is done. Now, instead of just saying backfill borehole and don't put this last part, because if you're the seller, you don't have the last part, that is risky. What do you mean by backfill? If you've never done this type of work before, you can backfill a hole without compacting it. That's backfilling, right? But if you want to do it in accordance with industry practice, the soil would have to be compacted, correct? That's right. A lot more work, but this is to protect the seller. If you're the listing agent, you want to make sure that is being done according to standard industry practices. See that? That takes care of that. So I send this to the listing agent, and we actually signed. No, actually they came back. They came back with something else. I'll show you what they came back with. Now, they came back with this. Excuse me. You see on the screen the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. In this particular case, if you take a look at this, you see this is an air form, right? It's not car form, but the language in here is exactly like what you see on the car form. It's just that it has an air form logo. So air form has its own agency disclosure. So in this case, you see that I did one for the, you see, even though the contract already has it, but I did a separate one, okay? It's just my preference. I like things to be full and complete, okay? Although if I missed it, I would have been fine anyway. Second one, I have the standard one. This is already signed, ready to go. And then, all right, that's from my client. And then I have, that's also signed and everything. This is probably signed by the seller already. Now that's an investment. See, this actually came from the.
Did they do counter offer or this?
They did. I'll come to it. But if you look at this form here, this is car form. You see that, right? This definitely did not come from me. If I use air form, I usually just keep the car form. So this came from the listing agent, all right? Because the listing agent's broker wants to have certain advisories provided to my buyer, okay? It doesn't hurt to give extra advisories, you know what I mean? It doesn't hurt, but it's not required on the commercial side. Commercial side, usually we don't do that, but I mean, you know, an extra protection for the agents, okay? And then they also have this advisory that they use. This also, this is not advisory, this is an environmental report. They previously did, they just provide this to us, so they gave it to my buyer, okay? So the listing side, they did some report already. And then they have the supplemental statutory and contractual disclosure. Now, as you can see, this is a car form, right? Instead of using the SPQ, they use the supplemental statutory and contractual disclosures. That's fine. If they want to do extra disclosure, even though it's not really required on the commercial side, but they did it anyway, so I just took it, right? This is actually an air form. This is pretty much mandatory for commercial transactions. It's called the property information sheet. This is what we use for commercial disclosure. So this is one that we use. This is mandatory for commercial, the property information sheet. She did not have the form, so I actually generated the form for her to fill out. And then we email it to the seller to complete, okay? Yeah, all right? All right, so that is, and then here we have buyer's affidavit. I don't really want to show you this one because there's nothing to talk about. Usually this is not really required. Addendum, now this is the one that I wanted to show you. This actually came from them. She did not have the air form, so I gave her a form to use, but she filled out the rest for me, all right? So they have an addendum with some sort of a count. Now, in the commercial side, we don't have the counter form. No such thing as counter form. We just use addendum. We want to change something, okay? Yeah, you don't have the counter offer form on the commercial side. No, not on the air form. Yeah. As you can see, she was okay with everything that I proposed. In fact, she wanted my client to provide inspection reports to them within 48 hours of receipt, which we agree anyway. Now, if you're on the listing side, this is a very good provision to use because whatever inspection report that you can receive, that's going to help your seller. So they ask for it. So we agreed to provide that, okay? And then they have a bunch of exclosures. These are mainly just the car forms, a bunch of car forms here, which we normally don't use on the commercial side, okay? All right, close this one. Okay. SBSA, you know what SBSA is for those of you who
do you use SBSA for
not for commercial, we don't. It's normally used by realtors, not for commercial agents.
Oh, okay.
Commercial agents don't use SBSA. Okay, we don't care about using, well, I am on both sides, so I'm a commercial and a residential, okay? Now, addendum is what we had to increase the number of boreholes, so we prepare an addendum 2. You look at addendum 2, right? Oops, what did I, what happened to my addendum 2? Now, I tell you what should read inside. What happened was right after we signed the contract, the geologist came back to tell my buyer that they needed to do 2 boreholes. Okay? So I think, yeah, they needed to do 2 boreholes, so I had to change the contract. At first we agreed on 1 borehole, now we have 2 boreholes, right? Okay. All right, great. So
for oil.
I don't know. All right, next one. NHD, I'm not going to talk about NHD, right? Okay. Next we have supplemental property tax bill. That's a standard CAR form. This agent was very careful about disclosure, so she gives me all kinds of disclosure. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. In fact, it's a good practice anyway. Okay. That's a CAR form. That's a CAR form. Yeah. That's another CAR form. Don't worry about this one. If you open up, you know what it is. Special tax assessment about the notice. Not required, but you know this agent wanted to give that. Special tax and assessment. Buyer's inspection advisory, we have already seen that one. This particular form, that's another addendum. Look at that. I can't remember who prepared this one. This is another addendum. This one that is after we decided that we needed more studies because the boreholes themselves are not enough. So the geologist came back and said, we need to dig trenches. So I asked the geologist, how wide of a trench do you need to dig and how deep and where you're going to dig? So they told me they need 2 overlapping trenches of 40 feet length, up to 3 feet width, and up to a maximum of 15 feet depth. You got to put those things in here if you are the listing agent. You want to make sure everybody knows how long of a trench they can dig, how wide the trench can be, and how deep they can go. All right? And it says upon locations approved by the sellers prior to digging work. In fact, I believe I drafted this provision. And then it says here, buyers shall backfill and compact. You see, this is the first time I use compact. Compact the trench. You see, for the borehole, it's hard to compact a borehole. That's why I don't use compact. But for trench, you can actually compact the trench. So compact the trenches according to standard industry practices, right? And then say, buyers shall provide sellers any report prepared for such trenching work at no cost to seller. I drafted this. And they signed it, apparently. Yep, signed by my client. And this one don't have the seller signature, but I assure you, we do have one that was signed by the seller. And then later on, it turns out that after they dug the trenches, they discovered landfill, so we have to cancel. And then the listing, so I sent an email to the escrow 38 days after acceptance, so well within the contingency period. Sent it to the escrow, telling them we canceled because there was an active landslide. And then still the listing agent wanted a cancellation done, so we had to do a cancellation. Now she wanted to do it on a card form, so I did it on a card form, so that's okay, right? So in the card form, we cancel. Now in this case, how did I write the cancellation? I say buyer's non-satisfaction of source inspection per paragraph 9 of the agreement. See that? When you write cancellation, it's always better to reference a certain paragraph in the contract that gives you the right to cancel. And then it says what provision? Source inspection. Which paragraph? Paragraph 9, right? And then this one also says what to do with the deposit. Here it says seller authorizes release of buyer's deposit to buyer, correct? So this is done, email to client, and then we email to the other side, and then given to the escrow, and now my client received the deposit back, and that's the end of the transaction with 0 commission paid to the brokers.
So much work.
No, actually this one I did very little work, mainly just the drafting. I don't even have to go to the site. See, the nice thing about commercial, you don't have to do AVID. No such thing as AVID for commercial. So.
Not the agent then required to do it.
No, they're not required. So it's a very little work, so it's okay. I mean, it's not too bad. All right, now let me go ahead and unmute so they can ask questions, all right? Hold on a second, all right? Don't leave yet. I'm going to unmute you guys.
You cannot download the form.
How do I unmute all? Here?
And let's go to participant there.
Participant?
Yeah, go there.
You work for Cisco?
No.
Yeah. No, I just unmute. Okay, unmute, right? All right, questions. Anybody has questions?
Kenny, can you hear me?
Hold on. Who's asking questions?
Kenny, this is Jonathan.
Yeah.
Do you, can you give us a sample of all the forms that you just created? Because
yeah, I will export all of these forms to my Google Drive that has that file. Oh, actually, you know what? I'll take you to. Hold on a second. I'll take you to my Google Drive. Okay. This one doesn't have all the forms yet, but let's see here. There's something else I want to show you. Hang on a second. I want to show you, this is my Google Drive folder. I can go ahead and export all of these forms that we use into this Google Drive folder. And I'll send invites to all of you so you can you can have access. All right. Now, a couple of things I want to show you, which is in order to indicate to the seller where we wanted the boreholes, we actually have the geologist put it on a map. You see the map? Now, you see the 2 stars? This is where we propose the boreholes. You see that? 1 star here and 1 star here, right? Now, you should do this. Speak to the geologist about getting the map prepared and then locate the boreholes and send this map to the seller for the seller's approval. You see the trenches here? You got 1 trench here and another trench here. This is how we mark the trenches. And then it says overlapping. You see the overlapping of the transfers. So the transfers actually overlap right here. Okay? So this is my Google Drive. Anyone else have any questions?
You notice commercial listing is not on MLS?
It was. Yeah, you can put commercial listing on MLS as well.
But what if they're not, how do you specify the commission?
It will say whatever the split is, but if it's a commercial agent who has no access to the MLS, then it's a problem. They have to communicate with the listing agent and then put it in the AIR contract with a fixed percentage. Instead of saying MLS rules, you will just say 3% of the purchase price. In this case, it was 3%. So instead of putting MLS rules, you put 3% of the purchase price.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Anyone else have questions? If not, I'm going to conclude this thing. All right. All right. Thanks for attending.